technically true, yet highly manipulated. Put another way, control, also known as psychological methods and tactics, are effective individually, but can be combined into exponentially more potent system of control known as trauma-based mind control, also known as psychological warfare, brainwashing, and coercive persuasion. The most insidious and effective form of mind control is that which is completely undetectable, wherein the victim believes the ideas, desires, fears, and behaviors implanted in their minds are their own. They are exercising their own free will, which in a way is technically true, yet highly manipulated. Put another way, mind control is not the removal of free will, but the usurping of it. Mind control can be employed at both an individual level as well as a collective level. Practically all of the fundamental mechanics and techniques of mind control apply in parallel across both the micro and macro levels. Once you've learned how it operates and being observant and vigilant, you can easily recognize this type of manipulation in your own interpersonal relationships as well as in communal, societal, and systemic institutions and cultural traditions. Not all mind control is inherently unethical, though one could argue about the semantics of this notion. But perhaps a useful delineation of the moral lines that could be drawn here are as follows. Light mind control can be seen as exercising ethical influence on others by using literal or artistic mediums to convey a message which is based in actual truth. The intentions behind it are to improve or benefit those you are trying to influence. It also respects the rights and autonomy of others and would never resort to deception, manipulation, or coercion. Its agenda or intended outcome is always for the elevation of consciousness, the betterment of all, and the holistic good. Teachers and parents, for example, are using light mind control when teaching their children or students that which is true and right. You could even consider this presentation as light mind control. Dark mind control is when the agenda is aligned to the interests of the one orchestrating it at the expense of its victims. Its agenda is the suppression and distortion of consciousness to exploit others for personal gain. It uses lies, distortions, manipulation, and abusive tactics to achieve its ends, and has no hesitation to violate the rights of others using coercion and even outright violence. This is the form of mind control we will be primarily observing within the context of this presentation. The mass mind control agenda is being carried out on a global scale by individuals who could be described as dark occultists. A dark occultist is one who utilizes the obscuration and monopolized leverage of the secret universal knowledge of cosmic law and esoteric psychology to maintain a power differential over the uninitiated masses at large. These social engineers hold high positions of power across key institutions of systemic infrastructure, including government, religion, banking, healthcare, media, education, and other fundamental organizations who can utilize these apparatuses in unison to perpetuate this mass mind control. They see themselves as gods, the rightful masters of humanity who can shape and manipulate the population of Earth as they see fit, as pawns to be used and abused to carry out their selfish will. These individuals understand that if you control a person's mind, you subsequently control their actions and therefore their creative power, which can then be co-opted to serve your own goals. This is why mind control is such a vital topic and why these dark occultists place their primary focus on expending vast energy and resources towards this practice. Control the mind and you control the world. The primary purpose of mind control at the highest level, as it is discussed in this presentation, is to keep the current control matrix in effect. The control matrix is the false reality that has been grafted upon the natural world in order to shroud and obfuscate the true reality of this world and our own infinite power and value. The ultimate goal of this system is the advancement of the New World Order agenda, to keep the masses locked in a state of perpetual slavery, with these dark elites acting as gods and rulers in total dominion over mankind. The system is fundamentally anti-human, and its sole function is the destruction of freedom and all that is good. And how is this accomplished? By making the people falsely believe that they are free, when in reality they are slaves. This is utilizing or exploiting the illusion of choice and offering limited or false dialectics, making them believe that freedom doesn't exist or that they do not deserve it, or by limiting their consent and the freedoms available to them through violence and coercion. The disempowerment of humanity is manifest by way of ignorance of self, their existential condition of slavery, and natural law, juxtaposed by the deeply intimate understanding of these dynamics possessed by the ruling class. The title I chose for this presentation is Mind Control and How It Perpetuates the Slave System. The term perpetuates is a verb that means to cause or prolong the continuation of something, often a negative or undesirable situation or behavior. It refers to the act of maintaining, sustaining, or keeping something in existence or in a particular state over a prolonged period of time. When something perpetuates, it typically continues or remains unchanged, often reinforcing or prolonging an existing condition, pattern, or belief. Mind control is the self-reinforcing mechanism which perpetuates the system of slavery and keeps it in place. If spirituality is defined as the expansion of consciousness, and mind control is the suppression of consciousness, then mind control is de facto spiritual warfare. Mind control or coercive persuasion is an ancient practice which has been around for millennia, probably longer, but was greatly refined and perfected over the last century. Most antiquated knowledge about this topic generally originated from rulership, dungeons, that is to say torture, and churches via religious conversion. To learn more about the ancient sources of mind-controlled knowledge, you can study despotism, overt slavery and serfdom, the Dark Ages, the Spanish Inquisition, and even American revivalism, which is, more modern but on the cusp. Most modern knowledge about this topic comes from a wide variety of sources. Interrogation and torture of dissidents of war, POW camps. This was very widespread with the Russian, Nazi, Chinese, and Korean soldiers. Scientific and government operations conducted by academia and military and intelligence organizations. And usually there was a lot of commingling of the two. Ivan Pavlov, Edward Bernays, B.F. Skinner are some examples of scientists who really pioneered a lot of this knowledge in the modern day. The Montreal experiments, MK Ultra, and Tavistock Institute. Now, much of the documented information are regarding research and experimentation of mind control funded by the CIA under projects such as MK Ultra and the Montreal experiments under Cameron. These projects claim to have been focused on the methods of electroshock therapy, various psychotropic drugs, and other peripheral techniques. The official narrative is that these experiments were generally found to be ineffective and deemed as failures. However, it is my opinion that one of three are the more likely explanation. One is that these particular declassified projects serve as a red herring to distract the public from other more successful projects which are still classified in secret. 2, the techniques were actually more successful than the ostensible outcomes were reported. And 3, these projects employed other techniques not listed, which were far more effective. Honestly, I think the most likely is that it's probably some combination of all three. Of course, this is pure reasonable speculation on my part, but one simply needs to ask themselves, When does the government ever fully disclose the full truth about anything, especially secretive experiments to control the human mind? Simply consider that with matters such as these, sometimes failure and incompetence is more palatable to the public than willful and competent evil. It is more favorable to these institutions to accept the backlash of a failed experiment than to admit that they now have the capacity to control people and the moral corruption to use it. Then you have hostage and kidnapping situations such as the Normanstourg bank robbery and the famous case of Patricia Hearst, and religious cult phenomena such as Heaven's Gate, Jonestown, Branch Davidians, and the Manson family. Now, to me, it is also just as plausible that some of the famous religious cults were actually carried out by covert intelligence operatives who were conducting microcosmic field experiments to prepare for scaling up to the societal level. Again, it is dubious speculation. However, it is entirely feasible to me. It is much easier for the public to accept that these cult leaders were simply rogue outliers who just so happened to have a profoundly deep understanding of cult techniques to a high level of competence. So let's look at some fundamental psychology. To properly understand mind control and how it operates, one must first have some basic understanding of how the mind itself works. The law of mentalism is the principal fundamental truth that all forms in manifestation, physical or otherwise, are first conceived via mentation. First from the mind of the all, the divine cosmic consciousness that created this reality. Then we reflect this as individual fractals of divine consciousness and lesser creators in God's image via the law of correspondence, as above, so below, as within, so without. This is going to be a very prevalent theme throughout this presentation of this internal and external, this correspondence dynamic. Again, this is precisely why mind control is such a prevalent dynamic, an essential concept to understand. All is mind. Control the mind, control the world. And keep in mind, this works both ways, in both a light and dark connotation. If the collective mind is aligned with truth and morality, we can create a world that is harmonious and prosperous for all beings. But if the aggregate mental state is deviated from truth and morality, the inescapable result is hell on earth, which is what we have right now. So this is the triune brain. Triune means 3 in 1. So the human brain has these 3 levels: the R complex, the limbic system, and the neocortex. The R complex is the reptilian brain, limbic is the mammalian brain, and the neocortex is the human brain. So the R complex is in charge of survival, fight or flight, instincts, automatic functions, and stimulus response. This is also known as the brain stem. It is the lizard brain. Then you have the limbic system. This is in charge of reproduction, rest and digest, emotions, memories, and habits. And then the neocortex is the human brain, responsible for higher cognition, language, rational and abstract thinking, creativity, awareness, and morality. And these levels are a sort of a hierarchy, each building on the lower levels to unlock higher states of consciousness. All components must be balanced and in healthy functionality in order for the brain to be working at optimal capacity. Then within the neocortex, you have the left and right hemispheres. The left side of the brain is the masculine side. The right side of the brain is the feminine side. This has nothing to do with male and female, although men tend to be more left brain dominant and women tend to be more right brain dominant. But what I mean by masculine and feminine is that these correspond to masculine traits or tendencies. So again, left brain is all about specific thinking, analytical thought. It is numbers, it is language, reasoning, logic, science, and math. The right side is holistic thinking. It is emotional. It deals with imagination, expression, art, intuition, creativity, and so forth. So as I said, when the brain is working in a state of imbalance, this starts to cause some problems. So when a person is too left brain dominant, it results in executive function of the R complex. So you lose emotionality and higher human thinking. You're in your base brain, and this results in what is called master mentality or dominator mindset. You become ruled by selfishness and base desires and obsessed with control. Conversely, when a person becomes right brain imbalanced, it results in executive function of the limbic brain. This results in slave mentality. You're ruled by emotions and become very passive. It is only through proper balance of both hemispheres and the neocortex acting as the executive command center that the full human capacity for true intelligence can fully be unlocked and accessed, especially that of the frontal lobe where empathy and morality are sourced. The word intelligence is a combination of two words, intellect and the generative principle. So the intellect is the logical principle. The generare, which comes from Latin, is the creative principle. So together, these words make intelligence. So true intelligence is the left and the right side both coming together. Now for some fundamental philosophy. So to explore philosophy in the search for truth, one must first examine the concept of truth itself and whether or not it exists. To even ask this question is a validation that it does, for to ask any question is to imply that there is an answer, one which is based in objectivity and universally consistent. Truth is not subject to perception, emotions, or belief. It simply is. Truth is the highest authority in the universe. Knowledge is but truth discovered, and if knowledge is power, then ignorance is powerlessness. The Latin word for both freedom and book is liber. The word liber means both freedom and book. This tells you something very important. In reality, in truth, knowledge and freedom are inextricably linked. So, on the other hand, you have solipsism. Solipsism is the assertion that the existence of only one's own mind as certain, and the existence and nature of external reality as uncertain or unknowable. Again, all solipsistic arguments are self-defeating, since this very belief is an assertion that this is the true position, not subjectively but objectively and in all cases. It is the automatic implication that external reality exists as the realm of truth. To state anything or to ask a question is automatically asserting that truth exists by either stating something as true or asking a question to invite or contemplate the answer, which is a truthful answer. Otherwise, there's no point in even saying or asking or even doing anything. Solipsism is the single greatest mind virus known to humanity and is spreading like a plague, largely thanks to New Age religion. The most powerful way to keep people cut off from truth and knowledge is to convince you that they don't exist. And if people don't have knowledge, they don't have freedom. This is the most powerful form of mind control. The spiritual experience is foundationally based upon the prime concept of self-ownership, the simple and fundamental truth that you are the sole steward and benefactor of your body, your mind, and your freedom to exist and interact in the world, over which you alone hold rightful authority. This idea must first be understood psychologically, but also embodied and actively applied to one's state of existence in order to be fully realized. Self-ownership can be qualified through the concepts of autonomy and sovereignty as the internal and external expressions of it. Autonomy is defined as the state, power, or right of self-government, the self-directing freedom, and especially moral independence. Very key, that moral aspect there. It means independent, living one's own laws. The doctrine of the will giving itself its own law based on conscience. Autonomy is essentially your right to freedom. Any action that does not initiate harm is a freedom, and personal boundaries as an extension of self-ownership. To be sovereign comes from two words in Latin, super, which means above, beyond, or over, and regnum, reign, which means to rule or govern. So sovereignty means you are beyond or above external rulership or government. It is an extension of your autonomy, which states that your boundaries and right to self-rulership are valid and sacred and should not be infringed. Your sovereignty is quantified by your spoken or unspoken consent. So, autonomy affirms your inherent right to freedom and self-rulership, and sovereignty negates the right of any external force from infringing on your freedom or attempting to rule over you. So these two terms come down to the simple idea that you own yourself and no one else owns you. And naturally, you do not have the right to take any action which violates the autonomy and sovereignty of another person. Such an action would be a performative contradiction and hypocrisy, since it's impossible to consent to having your consent violated. You would be doing something to someone else that you would not want done to you. Autonomy and sovereignty are not conditions which are granted or bestowed by any person or institution. They are inalienable rights which are inherent to your being by nature and birthright. They can never be given or taken away, only violated, ignored, and neglected. Autonomy and sovereignty are the internal and external expressions of self-ownership and correspond to the non-aggression and self-defense principles. A sovereignty violation to another is abuse of their autonomy. Therefore, a being should apply the non-aggression principle to their own autonomy, in other words, not using your self-rulership to initiate harm, so as not to infringe on the sovereignty of others. And a being should exercise the self-defense principle to protect their own sovereignty, should someone else choose to abuse their autonomy. A sovereignty violation is a performative claim of ownership over another. That is, they are acting as if the other or their property is their own property to do with what they wish, against their consent or will. They are taking an action which is not a right, that which does not initiate harm, and therefore a wrong. Slavery is the ownership of another human being and their property. This includes their body, their mind, their possessions, and the fruits of their labor. Slavery is the current condition which humanity is in. This is mostly due to the systems of control which operate entirely through means of violence and coercion. Such violations are an inherent claim of ownership upon its victims and a violation of their free will. Therefore, the system is one of slavery. It does not matter if these conditions are covert or overt, their methods euphemized and rationalized. Physical slavery is an objective condition that exists when the previously defined requirements are met. There are two forms of slavery, overt and covert, as I said. Overt slavery is what most people imagine when the subject is brought up to them. Shackles, whips, toiling in the fields, etc. But slavery has evolved, become more advanced in the covert form. This is a much more effective method where its victims believe that they are free, do not realize they are slaves, or worse yet, believe that their slavery is rightful and legitimate. Slavery begins in the mind. Once an individual realizes their sovereignty and autonomy and mentally reclaims it, they are no longer a slave, even if they are physically coerced, harmed, or even killed. Therefore, the mind is the ultimate battleground for control via the slave system. In order to actualize and exercise self-ownership, one must be able to identify and understand the borders of your own state of being, where you begin and where you end. As an extension of self, your boundaries are simply the borders which determine the jurisdiction of your domain of authority, that which is and isn't yours to govern and control. That's where the ego comes in. The ego is simply one's own sense of self. It is your mental construct of the spatial or physical and identity, which is psychological, aspects of who you are, and by apophysis, who you are not. It is important to note that the ego is your own mental conception of yourself, not the actuality of who you are. This conception can be accurate, or it can be distorted and wildly illusory. Perception and reality are two separate concepts which can closely align or drastically differ. The ego operates from the reptilian brain and left hemisphere. Its primary purpose is survival. It is a useful and powerful ally and is an integral part of you and your mind. It is not your enemy. There is so much demonization of the ego going on, again, especially thanks to the New Age, and this shows such a lack of understanding of psychology and spiritual philosophy. The ego is simply wounded and needs to be healed, balanced, and integrated, not destroyed. Such an endeavor to kill the ego is right brain imbalance, New Age nonsense, and not only highly unhealthy, but impossible and asinine. A healthy ego is a healthy, balanced, and integrated sense of self. An unhealthy ego is a self-conception which is either overinflated or diminished. This manifests behaviorally as either a domineering, narcissistic personality type or the passive submissive type, both of which lack healthy boundaries. So without the ego, you have no boundaries, or your boundaries are way extended out further than they should be. So the triad, the trinity, and the trivium are all three-tiered feedback loops, which have direct internal and external correspondence to one another. They are syncretic and complementary. Essentially, they're the same system, just from different paradigms, and they overlap perfectly. Together, they are what create the conditions of our world, as individuals and collectively in the aggregate. So, this is the mind, body, spirit triad. The body, as you see here with the blade symbol, represents the physical realm where the body exists. The blade is a masculine symbol, as you remember from the previous slides. Above that is the mental realm. Above that is the spiritual realm, represented by the feminine. This is called the chalice.